This is Behind the Scenes. I'm Scott Sexsmith. The clock continues to tick away for Sudbury's safe consumption site. Sudbury.com's Jenny Lamothe is here with the latest. Jenny, when we last spoke on this, it had been over 2 years since the funding application had been submitted with a deadline of December 31st looming. What's the latest?
Well, we have had some interesting news here in Sudbury that after a rally and after consistent cries from our municipal politicians and our provincial politicians, we have got a local company, Valley Base Metals, is going to be putting $75,000 into the site. They were also one of the original investors. They put money when it first opened last year. So it looks as though the site will be able to open throughout January 2024, giving a little more than a month of time to continue to figure out what's going on with funding.
All right, so the draft budget for the city of Sudbury did not include any form of funding. What are city officials saying about that, and what's their position?
When the city first gave funding to the supervised consumption site, it was because there was a wait for Health Canada and also for provincial government funding. It had been applied for several months previous. In fact, it's 2 years to the day that they had applied for that funding. So the city decided to step up while waiting for that provincial funding to allow the site to open. It was never part of their plan to continue funding the site. And at this point, we've had a 4.7% increase in our city budget. And so there isn't much room within that. And additionally, the city is pointing to this as a healthcare problem. And so they would like increased funding from the provincial government in order to cover these supervised sites.
Has the recent shooting, Jenny, at a Toronto consumption site, do you think, impacted the province's stance on these supervised consumption sites? What are Jamie West and French Elena saying?
So that was sort of the moment that there was a decision to make a review of all of the currently open supervised consumption sites. There was a shooting in Toronto that involved a person who was using the site, but it was sort of an isolated incident and not something that was associated with the supervised consumption site itself. But the provincial government did decide at that point that they wanted to evaluate every site. And so they paused funding until this review was completed. It has not been completed at this point. But our two MPPs for Sudbury and for Nickel-Belt, Sudbury's Jamie West, and we have Nickel-Belt French Elena, who is also the health critic for the NDP, have spoken about the number of lives that will continue to be lost in Sudbury, and that France very specifically said on the December 1st rally that it was the first of the month, and that is always a time when there are spikes in deaths from toxic poisoning here in Sudbury. And to her, the idea that these sites weren't going to be open to help these people was a cruel concept, and she couldn't stand behind any government that was going to be doing that. So she had some very strong words, and they have been a part of this process all along to keep pushing for this site to remain open as part of the opioid crisis, as part of the toxic poisoning crisis. And we also have a summit going on here in Sudbury that started today and is continuing to tomorrow, that is inviting many people to an invitation-only event to discuss what next steps might be taken in the battle itself.
So funding expires on the last day of December from the province. $75,000 has looked after the month of January. What happens on February 1st?
That's left to be seen, unfortunately. There is hope that there will be some answers coming from this opioid summit. There's at least 200 people coming to Sudbury, some local, some out-of-town politicians and things like that, to learn a little bit more from people with lived and living experience here in Sudbury who can inform those decisions. But at this point, we don't know what's going to happen to the supervised consumption site. And unfortunately, with the funding that was in place anyway, there were still significant limitations. They were not able to be open the hours that they wanted. They were not able to provide the services that they wanted to offer. And so that paints a picture as well as a supervised consumption site that's not working correctly, when in fact they could be working very well if the funding amounts come in. So I think there's a lot of hope in the cities, specifically because, Valley has spoken up to do something. They're hoping that more industry will help with that. But again, it's completely up in the air as to what will happen to the spot at the end of January.
All right. Jenny Lamothe from Sudbury.com. Thanks for this, Jenny, and thanks for taking us behind the scenes.